taking us a little bit out of the realm of applications that Mohammad Reza and Stacy had us in, I wanted to talk about a core algorithm, a core idea from linear algebra that shows up in machine learning quite a bit, the singular value decomposition. And what I want to convince you by the end of this talk is that the singular value decomposition is a refactor. So the singular value decomposition, if you're not familiar with it, it's a very important algorithm. Just some examples of the SVD in action. Principal components analysis is an application of it. The discrete Fourier transform is an application of singular value decomposition, which includes JPEG, the image encoding technique. Computing the pseudo-inverse, which actually came up, I don't know if you noticed it in Mohammad Reza's talk. Computing the pseudo-inverse was an important part of the RBF training step. And computing the pseudo-inverse is typically done via the singular value decomposition. That is related to why it shows up when we try and solve linear regression. If all of those examples seem a little bit too perhaps academic for you, video foreground isolation, recommendation engines, page rank, and more, all these very useful application domains, the singular value decomposition shows up. And despite that, broad array of applications, is actually deceptively simple. The singular value decomposition simply states that we can break a matrix down into three particular pieces, which usually go by the names U, sigma, and V transpose, where U is a matrix that's usually kind of tall and skinny. V transpose is a matrix that's kind of wide and short, a squat. And then in between is a matrix sigma that is a diagonal matrix. This is a singular value decomposition, and this way of writing it sort of emphasizes the idea that this matrix M on the left is equal to the product of the matrices on the right. But I think there's a slightly different view that I want to take that's going to lead us to this view of the SVD not as like an algebraic equation, but instead as a process akin to refactoring and programming. And first, we need to change a little bit the way we think about matrices. So matrix vector multiplication is more like function application than it is like the multiplication of scalars. We should think of a matrix not just as an array of numbers, though sometimes thinking of it that way is helpful, but instead as an object that takes in certain kinds of inputs and returns certain kinds of outputs. So on this slide, I'm showing a matrix M in red, taking in a vector X in blue, and returning an output, M, which we call M times X, that is in purple and is also an array. So this view, sometimes it's useful to think of matrices as a bunch of numbers. Other times it's useful to think of them as functions that act on vectors. So this singular value decomposition is a decomposition of a function. It's taking the matrix M and undoing the process of composing it. Functions are composed. They're combined together, one function after another. And the end result of composing a bunch of functions is also a function. So that's expressed by this diagram on the right-hand side here. So the way to read a diagram like this, let me pull up my laser pointer, is that we start up here in the top left with an array with n entries, and M is a function represented by an arrow that takes us from n entry arrays to m entry arrays, lowercase m. On the size of the array. But we can alternatively think of this arrow here as a sequence of arrows, as a sequence of steps, V transpose followed by sigma followed by U. So that's the content that is on the left-hand side here expressed as an equation is also expressed by this diagram here. These diagrams, commutative diagrams is what they're called, say that if I follow these arrows and end up at the same place as following any other path, then I must get the same result. So that's saying that V transpose followed by sigma followed by U is the same as M. So this, if we think of our singular value decomposition as a decomposition, as the reversal of composition, the connection to refactoring becomes a little bit more clear. Refactoring programs involves a couple of common tricks. Separation of concerns to say this function does one thing and this function does another. I don't mix them all together, peas and carrots together, cats and dogs lying together, these sorts of awful things. We also sort of remove code that doesn't do anything. Oh, I don't actually need to check that. It's guaranteed not to have that value. This code is dead. It no longer refers to anything of use. Those are examples of refactoring tricks. Breaking up into functions is another important refactoring trick, decomposing functions that have been already sort of pushed together too much. And these all have direct equivalents for matrices. So for separation of concerns, we have eigenvectors and eigendecomposition to sort of split up a matrix from a whole bunch of things happening all at once to, n things happening on n different eigenspaces or eigenvectors. For throwing out code that doesn't do anything, we have low rank approximation. This part of the matrix is unimportant. I will throw it out. This part of the code doesn't do anything. I will delete it. And for breaking up into functions or decomposing, we have singular value decomposition. When we refactor software, this decomposition step looks something like this. I have some function here on the right that's very tersely written. This one here returns the string true if the input is odd and the string false if the input is not odd. I can break that up into 3 steps, just sort of looking at this guy and saying, okay, what are the pieces of this function? First, we use mod2 to sort of check whether the input is divisible by 2 or not. Then we treat that value as a Boolean, not just as a number. So not just as 0 or 1, but as true or false. That's in the if-else step. And then finally, we return a string for our final output. So we return true if the Boolean is true, and we return false as a string if the Boolean is false. So we can break those out and make those all separate functions. And now our isOdd function at the top is a sequence of 3 operations that are written out rather than the sort of tightly compacted thing that's on the left. It's a matter of taste, maybe, which of these is the right way to write it, and maybe neither is really the right way to write it. But the important thing is that we can do it. We can split this function up if we want, and we can take this function, this set of functions, and we can collapse them down into a single one. This is the process of refactoring and rewriting software. And in this case, one function is being decomposed into 3 pieces. So this should remind you a little bit of that diagram of the SVD I showed just a few slides ago. So we start off with an integer that we want to check whether it's odd. And if we feed it to the function isOdd, what we should get out is a string, true or false. Maybe we're printing this to a user who wants to know whether their input is odd or not. And what this diagram is saying is that we can apply 3 separate functions and get the exact same result. So this way of writing isOdd really emphasizes that it is implemented in this particular way as mod2, then toBool, then toString. Mod2, the toBool function checks whether that mod2 output is equal to 1, and the toString one just takes that Boolean and turns it into a string. So let's talk about what those 3 pieces are. So the way of understanding those 3 pieces in a way that is going to generalize is to say that they do 3 separate things. That mod2 picks out sort of representative examples, that toBool reversibly renames them, and that toString then gives them the right type for the output. So to be more specific, when I say that mod2 picks representatives, what I mean is that we need a representative for each output. One representative integer that is the example of an odd number, and one that is the example of an even number. So mod2 corresponds to picking as our examples 0 and 1. Somebody else might use 1 and 2 as their examples. They would have a different function than mod2, but they would be doing in this decomposition the same thing, saying, I want to pick out a representative even number and odd number, because that's what those are the things that I give different answers for. And it simplifies our function down. We just need to know how it works on 2 different inputs rather than on every possible input. And then we need to know which group each input falls into. So then toBool reversibly renames those inputs. So it associates each representative with its output, sort of 1 to 1, in a way such that each output is targeted by exactly 1 representative. So we have 0 and 1, right? We have an example odd number, and we have an example even number. And now we just need to sort of be like, okay, which one of these is which? Is 1 the odd number, or is 0 the odd number? So 1 is the odd number, so it goes to true, and 0 goes to false. And that's this step here, toBool. And then finally, we need to put them in the correct type. So our output there was not necessarily the right type. It was just true and false. And so we need to recognize the output of our function inside of our output type. There are many strings besides just true and false. There's fru and talse for one. There's the, all kinds of books and the content of this presentation. All of that is inside the type string. Lots of stuff besides true and false. So we need to find inside true, we have to find the outputs that we want to associate with our two values. So we just say the Boolean true becomes the string true, the Boolean false becomes the string false. Pretty straightforward, relatively simple step. But this may seem a little bit trivial with this function, but if any function, you can do this three-step composition where I take some function func, and first I do an onto transformation where I pick out representatives. Okay, so I have a representative for each type of output I'm going to give. Then I apply a reversible function that says, okay, this representative is the one that gets this output. 1 is an even number. 1 is an odd number. 0 is an even number. That's the reversible step. And then lastly, we have a one-to-one step where we sort of recognize that output that we had, which might not be every possible value of the output type. We recognize that as a subset of the output type. So that's the final step here. I broke it down into foo bar bas for cultural reasons of how programmers like to write these things. But those three steps onto reversible one-to-one are a general way to break down literally any function. So you can, if you need a refactor function, consider this three-step breakdown as a way of breaking down the function. So any matrix can also be decomposed into three pieces. And because matrices are simpler than any possible function, we can do a lot more than just breaking them down into those three very generic types of pieces. So if we apply this decomposition to a matrix, we get that we can split it up into three pieces: a wide matrix, a square matrix, and a tall matrix. The wide matrix has inputs that are bigger than its outputs, right? How wide a matrix is tell you how big its inputs are. How tall it is tell you how big its outputs are. And so what this is doing is it's doing the same thing of picking representatives that was done in the previous example by mod 2. So for linear functions, for things that are implemented by matrices, if two inputs are sent to the same output by the matrix, both of them are sent to 0. And 0 is sent to 0 by any linear function. And so what this is basically doing is this matrix is going to take everything that gets sent to 0 by m and send it to 0, but basically not do much else. So that's the first step. That's the pick representatives step. Then we have the reversible relabeling step. So that's the matrix in the middle. Here it's B. That one's, it's reversible, so it's square. Its inputs are the same size as its outputs. If it were not square, then there'd be no way to match inputs and outputs. Sort of a, you can't put toothpaste back in the tube kind of principle. So this is our relabeling step, this middle one. This is where we're sort of really doing most of the meat of the work. And then finally, we have this tall matrix where the outputs can be bigger than the inputs. And this one basically finds a copy of all arrays with some number of entries among the set of all arrays with a larger number of entries. So I could do that where like maybe the first R entries are all have a value, and then the last M minus R are all 0, or they're all 2, or they're all whatever I want. And then, or I could do it where, the last R are the ones that have entries. It's going to depend on exactly the details of the matrix M and what function it does. But basically, A is going to find a copy of this R-dimensional space that our middle matrix mapped onto inside the outputs. And it's going to do that in such a way that it gets the same answers as M applied to the original input. So this is the part where we recognize that, okay, true and false aren't the only strings that exist. There are many strings out there, so let's take true and false and turn them into strings, even though we know our function, can't produce all possible strings. So in this breakdown, that number R there is the rank of the matrix. It's the dimension of things that don't get mapped to 0 by that matrix. And that is that's going to be the size of the input of that last array there, A. And so in order to get the singular value decomposition, we just need to make some special choices, right? I said A, B, and C were pretty free to change around. I could multiply C by a number and divide A by a number, and I would get the same result. So if we make some specific choices, then we get the singular value decomposition. If we make B diagonal and we make A and C unitary, then we get this SVD. So unitary means no growing or shrinking of anything. So one motivation for doing that is that our diagonal matrix in the middle, that B, can do all the growing and shrinking for us, right? Our first step was just picking out representatives, and our last step was just recognizing our outputs in like our outputs inside another type. And so there's no need to really grow or shrink there. So we can put that all in the middle, in that diagonal matrix. So the growing, shrinking, so no growing and shrinking, but maybe some turning around and some reflecting and things like that. That's what's allowed by unitary transformation. And if we do that, that gives this generic style of decomposition that can be applied to any possible function. If we make these specific choices, then we get the singular value decomposition as the output. As a technical note, this specific choice of the exact shapes here is what's called a compact SVD. So you might see something slightly different, but the principle of breaking a matrix down into these 3 pieces that are doing effectively the same 3 things is going to hold no matter what kind of SVD it is that you're computing. The compact SVD happens to be most useful when you're doing maybe a little bit more algebra type stuff, whereas the other kinds are maybe more useful when you're doing actual numerical computing. So this is just sort of one perspective on the SVD, and it's a uncommon one. I came up with it while trying to understand pseudo inverses, and then found a couple of other people talking about this, but it doesn't seem to be the most common way to think about the SVD. But I do think it gives me a sort of different and interesting insight into what's going on. And I guess the only last point I'd make is that this style of decomposition comes from something called the first isomorphism theorem, which gets used in abstract algebra all over the place and actually gives you different insights depending on which structure it is you apply it to. And it tends to show up and sort of develop really interesting concepts no matter what it is you apply it to, whether it's group theory or fields or ring theory or whatever it is you're doing with your algebra. This first isomorphism theorem shows up, and it gets generalized very broadly in category theory to be applicable to just an absolute bewildering array of mathematical objects. And every time it gets applied, a new interesting concept pops up. So it's cool to me that this singular value decomposition, which is also this workhorse algorithm, shows up among these as this deep mathematical concept. So with that, I'll close out my talk, and I will take any questions if folks have them.